In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace your rear brakes, pads, and rotors on this Hyundai Sonata. Let's get started. Use a 21mm socket, remove all 5 of your lug nuts, and then we'll take the wheel off. If your rotor still has the 2 securing screws on it, like mine, you're gonna have to get these off. And it's recommended that you use an impacting screwdriver. However, if you don't have one, here's a trick to break them free. Take a punch, a flat punch, and just hammer them, give them a couple taps. This will help break them free. It'll shock the threads. At this point, I have a Phillips bit that attaches to my air impact, but if you don't, you could probably get away with just using a screwdriver at this point. Take them out. If yours break or strip out, you don't have to reuse them. These are just here at the factory to hold the rotor on, but if you wanted to reuse them, of course you can. Now let's open the bleeder screw so we can compress the caliper later on. It's going to be a lot easier to open the bleeder screw now as it will be later when the caliper is not held on to the vehicle anymore. Get a 10mm wrench, work this back and forth. If yours is rusty like mine, you don't want to snap this off. Give it a couple spins and it should break free just like this. And once you do this, fluid should start coming out of it. And there we go, perfect. Now that fluid comes out, we'll cap this off. We'll come back to this in a little bit when it's time to compress the piston of the caliper. Now use a 14mm socket and remove these 2 bolts that hold the caliper onto the bracket. Leave this one in so it can hold the caliper while you take the other one off. Take both of them out. Now just grab the caliper and pull it off, set it to the side over here. Now we can take out our brake pads. Sometimes you'll need a little pry bar to help you out here. These are pretty stuck. There's one. Let's take out this inner pad. There we go. At this point, I'm going to want to break the rotor free because it's stuck on the hub. If yours isn't, that's great, but for me, it's rusted on there. So I'm going to take a hammer and hammer around until it breaks free. Now, I'm not going to put a lug nut on for safety because the bracket is still on and it's going to hold it there. It can't fall off. Avoid hitting the lug studs, of course. That would damage the threads. I guess it only took 1 hit. So at this point, in order to fully remove it, we're gonna have to take off the caliper bracket. And to get this caliper off, unfortunately, one of the bolts is right beside this control arm here. If you don't have a wrench that'll fit in there, which most wrenches will, you're unfortunately going to have to remove this control arm bolt. Pull this down so you can get a socket in there. But like I said, most wrenches will fit in there. So you could just use a regular box end wrench, and I'm not going to use this one, although it does fit, only because I have this one that's longer so I can get more leverage. But I can guarantee you this will do the job as well. Stick the wrench in here, make sure it grabs on nice and tight onto that bolt. You don't want to strip it out, otherwise you will be removing this control arm. And let's break it free. There we go. Let's get the top one off. And at this point, oops, don't lose that. At this point, as we unscrew this bottom one, we're going to want to pull the caliper bracket out, which is why I made sure the rotor wasn't seized earlier, because this bolt will stay in here and the caliper bracket with the rotor will come out again as I unscrew this. Because the bolt is easy to turn, I just switched to some needle nose pliers, and I'm basically just spinning it off with pliers at this point. Also because the wrench is starting to not fit so well in there as the bolt is loosening up and backing out. Make sure the rotor keeps coming off. Okay. At this point, you're just trying to overcome the parking brake shoes, which I'll show you in a second how to loosen up if yours are stuck. They shouldn't be, but if yours are, I'll show you how to do it. Now, we're at the point where we can remove both of these together. Now you can just use a pry bar, try to pry the caliper bracket away. There we go. And that comes out. Set it aside. and you can take your rotor off, discard it. At this point, I want to clean this whole area here, get all of this brake dust off, all the debris that's in here, and especially I want to get rid of the dust before I continue so that I don't breathe it in. Now I'm going to take a sanding disc. This is a worn out, gentle, soft sanding disc because I don't want to remove material. I just want to get the rust off of here. You want a nice flat surface for the rotor to sit on. And coming back to these two mounting screws for the rotor, if yours are broken or they're stuck in here for some reason, you want to make sure you either remove them or grind them flush because you don't want these to protrude out. Otherwise the rotor will not sit flat on this hub and you'll have big issues down the road. So having said that, let's do some cleaning. For these areas that are hard to reach, you can either use a wire brush or a wire wheel on a drill, or like me, on a die grinder. Rinse it down with brake parts cleaner. And now let's coat this in anti-seize so that it doesn't rust in the future. Put a thin layer on, avoid getting it on the lug studs, and try to get it around this ridge here where the hub meets the rotor. That will help prevent the rotor from seizing on there. Before we move on, let's pop this rubber boot out of the old rotor so that we can reuse it in the new one. Just push it out from the back side and then grab it from here. There it is. What this does is it covers this hole in the rotor that you can use to reach the adjuster for the parking brake and de-adjust it. This is what the adjuster looks like. You would spin the rotor, get through that hole, stick a screwdriver, pry bar in there, and spin this to contract or expand the shoes. Having said that, let's put the rotor on, and I'm putting it on backwards so I can clean the braking surface. Take brake parts cleaner and a clean rag and wipe off any oils or debris that might be on this. Flip it over, install it this way, and we'll do the same to this side. However, we can't finish putting it on because, as you remember, the caliper bracket has to go on with it, so we have to wait until that's ready to go. I am, however, going to put this little plug in here, and that way it's there. I'm not going to forget about it. And with the caliper off, we can check the adjustment of the parking brake. You can hear them drag a little bit, which is exactly what you want, but you don't want the rotor to be slowed down by the parking brake. That's perfect because we didn't touch it to de-adjust it when we took the rotor off. So if you don't have to, don't do it. Leave it adjusted as is. Now on our workbench, let's get the caliper ready for reinstallation. First thing I want to do is pop off these anti-rattle clips, get these out of the way so we can clean underneath them. And with those out, let's get a wire brush or a sanding disc. Depends on how bad your rust is. I actually might use a wire wheel on the die grinder and clean this up in here. That's cleaned up now. Let's do the slider pins, get those out of here, clean up the old grease, and we'll add new grease. Of course, if yours are seized in there and they're stuck, you're going to want to peel off this boot, spray some rust penetrant in there, put a socket on the end of it, and just work it back and forth, or a wrench, whatever you have. But mine are good, still has good grease in there, so I'm just going to add more. I like to add some inside of the boot here. This is going to act as a reserve of grease, but it will also get on this lip here, and that lip is what seals up against the end of the slider pin. So once you put it in, it'll be a nice watertight seal. Add some grease to the slider pin as well, but don't add too much because it's just going to get wiped off as you slide it in. I like to do these one at a time, that way I don't confuse the two. If there's any air stuck in here, squeeze the boot as you press the slider in. Give this a couple twists, and let's do the same to the other one. Press it in all the way, squeeze any air out, give it a couple twists. And now I want to put a thin layer of grease on these areas where we cleaned. The key word here is thin because if you put too much on, when you put the anti-rattle clips back, it'll actually squeeze onto the rotor, and you don't want that. You don't want any grease on the rotor, so obviously that would be bad. A thin layer will do the trick. You just want to prevent further rust from building up. Take the new anti-rattle clips, line them up. Once they're centered, just press them down and make sure you hear them snap into place. They have to lock in. They should not come off easily. If they do, they're not fully locked in. So figure out what's going on and then make sure you situate them on both sides all the way down. Now, let's get the caliper bracket back on the vehicle. Pull the rotor away slightly, get the caliper bracket over. We're gonna have to line these two up at the same time. I'm gonna give this some gentle taps because it needs to squeeze in between the threads of the bolt and the backing plate. It's in, but it needs to go a little more. There we go. That just seated into place. The bolt hole is lined up with the bolt. We can start threading it in. I'm going to use the same needle nose pliers I used earlier and just start the bolt into the caliper bracket. All right, looks like I got it started. At this point, this is what I'm looking at here, so there's no way I can fit a wrench. So I'm just gonna keep going until I can fit a wrench in here. All right, I can fit a wrench now. So I'm just gonna keep going with the wrench until it's pretty much bottomed out, and then we'll do the top bolt. Okay, so this one's snugged up. Let's get the top one in before it's too late. Threads in nicely. The torque for this is 54 foot-pounds. Obviously, I'm not gonna be able to torque this, so I'm just gonna wrench it until it's nice and tight, but I will torque this one because I can. 54 foot-pounds is the torque. Okay, that's snugged up. Okay, I'll give it a little extra. Okay, that's nice and tight right there. I had a long wrench with plenty of leverage, so that should do the trick. Now let's put the pads in. The inner pad's gonna have the wear indicator on the bottom. Make sure you put the correct one in. Slide them in. Make sure they can move around freely like this. If they can't, that means you didn't clean up enough rust and they will bind up as you apply the brakes and they'll wear prematurely. So it's important that everything moves freely. Put the outer pad in. There we go. Now it's time to compress this caliper piston to make room for the new pads and make sure it fits over, of course. So I'm gonna crack this bleeder screw open with my 10mm wrench. That's going to allow me to get the fluid out through here. Take your caliper depression tool of choice, slide it in here. This one doesn't quite fit perfectly, but it still fits. So very gently push this piston back until it is retracted all the way. That bottomed out. Everything was very smooth. If you're having a hard time pushing it in, the caliper's bad and you need a new one. Now let's wait until we get some steady fluid coming out of here, no air bubbles or anything like that. Then we can remount this. It looks like that's already the case, so let's close it up before we lose too much fluid. Okay, make sure it's nice and snug. Doesn't have to be crazy tight. Before I mount it, I want to clean this all up. That way brake fluid doesn't get all over my new brakes. You don't have to do this, this is optional, but you can put some grease on the ring, the outer ring of the piston here. This will help with potential noise, and do the same to these two ears of the caliper for the same reason. Take the caliper, slide it over the pads, make sure it lines up with the slider pins. That's one, and two. Don't forget to cap off the bleeder screw. Now, if you still had them and they're in good condition and you wanted to, you could put these two screws back, the retaining screws for the rotor. It is not necessary. Like I said, these are only there to hold this on at the factory on the assembly line. But if you do put them back, I highly recommend putting anti-seize on the threads of these two screws. That way they have less of a chance of being stuck on here in the future for the next brake job. Pump up the brake pedal. Let's do the same to the other side, and then let's put the wheels on. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and torque them to 80 foot-pounds.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.